On the 4th day of July in the year 1942, London awakened to a sound it had not heard in years. The city had known sirens and bombs, silence and sighs, but that morning it was the cadence of marching boots that broke the damp air. Night shadows lifted slowly off Westminster as a pale sun struggled through a veil of smoke and summer haze. The Thames ran sullen and gray. Sandbags still lined the embankment. Scarred buildings flanked the streets with their windows boarded and roofs mended hastily. White sheets of dust clung to statues and lampposts. The scent of damp stone mingled with the acrid memory of fires. Men and women stood waiting near Whitehall, wrapped in coats despite the mild weather, their breath visible in the cool dawn. In their pockets, they clutched ration books and worn photographs. Some carried small Union flags, the red dye faded by rain. Others held nothing but each other's hands. They waited because they had been told that this Independence Day would not be like the last two. They waited because word had spread through pubs and factories that Americans would march through the heart of the capital. As the hour approached, a hush settled over the crowd. Far off, beyond Trafalgar Square, came the faint thump of drums. It grew louder, regular as a heartbeat. Boots struck pavement. The cadence was slower than the clipped British quickstep, a deliberate pace that spoke of distance crossed and distance yet to come. The first ranks of the United States Army swept into view. They came from Piccadilly, turned onto the Mall, and headed toward Buckingham Palace. Sunlight caught polished helmets and glinted on bayonets. The stars and stripes fluttered above them. The American flag had flown in London before, but never had it preceded an organized column of U.S. infantry. Today it did. The band played. Brass instruments shone bright. The army goes rolling along, filled the air, then yielded to God Save the King. A murmur ran through the watchers. Some smiled, some cried. Older men removed their hats. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. Children atop their fathers' shoulders waved and shouted. They saw tall soldiers with square shoulders and broad smiles. They saw boys who could have been their brothers. They saw boots bigger than any they had worn. They saw American patches, unknown insignia, unknown names. They saw hope. Near Horse Guards Parade, Winston Churchill stood with his wife and other dignitaries. He was slightly hunched, his ever-present cigar clenched between his teeth, but his eyes were sharp. He wore a dark suit and a spotted bow tie. He had slept little. He had spent the previous night reviewing reports, reading cables from Washington and Moscow, worrying about Tobruk and Stalingrad. His country had stood alone 2 years earlier. It had endured bombings, a threatened invasion, the loss of ships, the rationing of bread, the darkness of winter. Now, as the drumbeat grew, he lifted his head. He watched the first line of American soldiers pass under the Admiralty Arch. He looked at their faces, clean, unlined, some nervous, some proud. He saw the confidence of a nation that had watched war from afar and finally chosen to join. His eyes misted. He took his wife's hand. He leaned slightly toward his colleague standing by his side. He whispered something that would stay in minds. It was not a speech into microphones, but a private observation. There, he murmured, marches the new world to the rescue of the old. Those boots are the sound of deliverance. Around him, cameras clicked. In the street below, the Americans swung their arms, their boots hitting the cobblestones with force. Above, flags snapped in the breeze. The Royal Standard flew from Buckingham Palace, and the Union Jack flew alongside the Stars and Stripes. Londoners who had known only austerity and fear in recent months stood straighter. To understand the weight of that morning, one must step back into the harsh winter of 1940. Britain had watched Europe fall under Nazi domination. Poland had been crushed. Belgium, the Netherlands, and France had capitulated. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven to the beaches of Dunkirk and evacuated at the last moment, leaving guns and vehicles behind. Britain stood alone on her island, ringed by coastal batteries and barbed wire, defended by fighters that were few in number, but flown by men with iron nerves. The Blitz came, bombs fell nightly. Fires lit up the Thames. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Submarines tried to strangle convoys bringing grain and oil across the Atlantic. Factories worked day and night. The people endured rationing, air raid sirens, nights in shelters and mornings filled with rubble. The government, under Churchill's bullish leadership, vowed never to surrender. He declared that the nation would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets. Behind the bravado lay fear. Supplies dwindled. The Royal Air Force was stretched thin. The Royal Navy fought in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The army had lost much of its equipment. Britain needed allies. Across the ocean, the United States watched war with a mixture of concern and reluctance. President Franklin Roosevelt supported Britain with words and, increasingly, with goods. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply ships, aircraft, trucks, weapons, and food to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the security of the United States. Britain received tanks, aircraft, locomotives, wheat, sugar, canned meat. The famous Jeep, the C-47 Dakota transport, the B-24 Liberator bomber all arrived thanks to American factories. American merchant sailors braved the Atlantic. The British Prime Minister traveled to Washington to meet Roosevelt. The two leaders forged a personal bond. They drafted the Atlantic Charter, a statement of common principles and hopes, on a battleship in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. They dined, smoked cigars, drank whiskey, and talked into the night about freedom of the seas, free trade, and self-determination. Churchill pressed for more help. Roosevelt, hamstrung by public opinion in Congress, gave what he could. A neutrality law still restricted what the U.S. could do. Isolationists said Europe's wars were not America's concern. Roosevelt watched the polls, maneuvering carefully. Then came December 7th, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was plunged into war. Germany, allied to Japan, declared war on the United States days later. The two oceans were now a single battlefield. Britain was no longer alone. The first American troops to arrive in Britain landed in Northern Ireland at the end of January 1942. They were members of the 34th Infantry Division, farm boys from Iowa and Minnesota, factory workers from Illinois. They stepped off ships on docks wet with Irish rain. British officials greeted them with handshakes and speeches. Local girls giggled at their drawls. Newspapers carried photographs of smiling GIs shaking hands with British generals. More troops followed. Operation Bolero, as the buildup was called, was planned to bring more than 1 million American soldiers to the British Isles. Airfields were expanded. New bases were constructed in East Anglia and Midlands. Quonset huts rose in green fields. Engineers laid runways for heavy bombers. Barracks were built. The 8th Air Force set up headquarters. American engineers built depots near ports, storage for millions of gallons of fuel, mountains of ammunition, warehouses filled with C rations, K rations, medical supplies. Lorries rumbled through villages with the stars and bars painted on their doors. Local residents learned new slang. They whispered about chocolate and nylons, about white bread and real coffee. They also whispered about the wages American soldiers were paid, which were higher than those of their British counterparts. Tensions flickered. Friendships were forged. American soldiers shared cigarettes with coal miners, sweets with schoolchildren, and dances with local girls. They discovered warm beer, bombed out pubs, double-decker buses, blackouts, and sirens. They were called Yanks, and in some cases, something less flattering. Good-natured rivalry emerged. The Yanks were seen as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. The Americans responded that the British were underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. Humor masked deeper questions. How would these armies work together? Could they coordinate? Could they trust one another? By the summer of 1942, the first contingent of American forces based in Britain were ready to be seen. A parade was scheduled for the 4th of July, symbolic for both nations. For the United States, it was Independence Day. For Britain, it would show solidarity with a new ally. It would also serve as a public declaration that the Atlantic Alliance had moved from paper to pavement. London still bore wounds from the Blitz. Craters scarred side streets. St. Paul's Cathedral stood blackened but unbowed. Posters urged civilians to careless talk cost lives and dig for victory. A great pall of dust still lay over the city. The aroma of fried fish and chips from a corner stall drifted across the square. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery in Covent Garden mingled with the scent of petrol. The roar of trams, the clip-clop of horses, the occasional backfire of a truck all became background to a new noise. It was the hum of a different engine. American trucks, their engines deeper, their horns louder. On the morning of the parade, Londoners lined the route hours in advance. They stood 6 deep along the mall. They perched on statues and monuments. Children held hands tightly. Women adjusted their hats and tucked stray curls under headscarves. Men in flat caps clasped pipes between their teeth. The procession began with military police on motorcycles, their white helmets distinctive. Behind them marched a color guard carrying flags. the American flag, the Union Jack, and the flag of the United States Army. The crowd fell silent as the Star-Spangled Banner began. It was a foreign song to many, yet its melody lifted spirits. The first battalions marched. Their uniforms were newer than those of British soldiers, their boots unscuffed, their buttons gleaming. Some wore steel helmets, some wore soft garrison caps. Their M1 Garand rifles rested on their right shoulders. They kept a steady cadence, eyes forward, chins level. On their sleeves were patches, a red bull, an Indian head, a golden acorn. These insignia would become familiar over the next years. Behind them came a field artillery battery, their 105 howitzers drawn by olive drab trucks, their barrels raised. Machine gun crews followed, marching in step with heavy tripods slung across their shoulders. Behind them rolled tanks, Stuart light tanks, their tracks clanking on the stones, their turrets covered with tarps. Jeeps came next, their windscreens folded down, their drivers grinning. Nurses marched, their skirts swinging, their Red Cross armbands bright. Members of the Women's Army Corps walked among them. They were not allowed into combat, but they would type, telegraph, drive, and chart. They smiled at the crowd smiled back. Faces along the route told their own story. A gray-haired woman in a shabby coat clutched a photograph of her son lost on the Ark Royal. Her lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer. A dock worker in oily overalls removed his cap and waved it. An elderly man with a chest full of First World War ribbons saluted as the color guard passed. A girl with pigtails and patched stockings held a Union Jack and an American flag crossed in her small fist. Tears streamed down a young wife's cheeks as she remembered nights in shelters. A shopkeeper's apprentice whistled softly to himself to hide his emotion. For 2.5 years, Britons had endured alone. They had welcomed soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Poland, but never before had they seen the sons of the United States en masse. They had read about them. They had listened to Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech on crackling radios. They had cheered news of Japanese setbacks at Midway. They had memorized the numbers. The United States would train 8 million men, build tens of thousands of aircraft, thousands of tanks, hundreds of ships. They knew American industrial output dwarfed that of Germany. Yet all these facts were cold. Now they were flesh and blood. Churchill watched more than a parade. He saw the culmination of years of persuasion. He had written to Roosevelt, telephoned him, visited him, argued, joked, pleaded. He had risked his political capital to press for help. He had told Parliament that he felt that the United States would draw the sword in the cause of freedom and cast the full weight of their mighty forces into the struggle. He had told Roosevelt that, "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." He had wept when he heard about Pearl Harbor, not solely out of sorrow, but also from relief that America would now fight. On that July morning, he realized that his words had become reality. As he watched the boots strike the stones, he reflected on the long road ahead. American troops in Britain were still few. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the German assault on the Eastern Front. The Japanese still occupied vast territories in Asia and the Pacific. North Africa was contested. Churchill knew there would be more Dunkirks, more Tobruks, more Stalingrads. He knew that the combined chiefs of staff were planning an invasion of French North Africa, not continental Europe. He knew the full weight of American might would not reach European shores for another year. Yet he also knew that momentum had shifted. For the first time since the fall of France, he felt that victory was possible. He gripped his cane. A tear rolled down his cheek. He did not brush it away. What he murmured that morning would never be recorded verbatim. Those close to him later recalled variations. They said he whispered, with awe, that this was the day the old world stopped being alone. Others remembered him saying that the tramp of American boots was like the distant roll of thunder that heralds a storm. Whatever the exact words, the essence was clear. He sensed that history had turned. Later that day, in a speech to the gathering assembled at Guildhall, he said publicly, "It is therefore with buoyant and serene feelings that I take the sword of the new world by the side of the sword of the old." People cheered. They cheered not only for Churchill, but for the idea that America had come. They cheered for cargo ships in convoy, for Liberty ships on the Clyde, for B-17s on the runways. They cheered for a pipeline from Liverpool to London, built by American engineers, delivering gasoline at 2,000 barrels per hour. They cheered for a factory in Detroit, stamping out 1 tank every hour. They cheered for the men of color who would serve in segregated units, for the Navajo code talkers, for the white farm boys, for the city kids from Brooklyn, for the sons of immigrants. They cheered for a partnership born of necessity, but rooted in shared ideals. In the following days, newspapers published photographs of the parade. The Times praised the discipline of the Americans and their impressive kit. The Daily Mirror ran a headline that said simply, "The Yanks are here." Letters poured in from the countryside. An elderly couple from Lancashire wrote to thank the Americans for coming. A mother from Eastham wrote to say that her young daughter now pretended to march like a GI. The BBC broadcast interviews with American soldiers. One private from Texas said he was proud to march in London on the 4th of July because his grandfather had fought at Yorktown. A corporal from Pennsylvania marveled at how calm the British were despite the bomb damage. An officer confessed he had never seen such neat uniforms on such rainy streets. British soldiers, who had been in the desert and on the North Atlantic, listened and smiled. They teased the Americans about their shiny boots and their chewing gum, but they also shared tips on how to handle blackout curtains and navigate London's alleys. Friendships began. A British Tom from Bermondsey invited a GI from Brooklyn to his family's cramped flat for tea and bread. The GI, who had never tried strong tea, made a face but drank it. He later wrote home about the kindness of the British. Rationing, he said, was tighter than he had imagined. Coal was scarce. Rooms were cold. Yet the people had warmth. He sent home photographs of Buckingham Palace and Big Ben. Behind the scenes, the parade masked frantic activity. American staff officers met their British counterparts daily. They grappled with questions of command, supply, training, discipline. How would American units be integrated into British defenses should Germany invade? Who would control airfields? What about Black American soldiers in a country used to racial segregation? These questions were thorny. The British government established guidelines for how Americans should behave. The British were asked to treat American soldiers as guests. There were tensions. Fights occurred in pubs over women and misunderstandings. Differences in pay and privileges created resentment. But the parade helped. It humanized the unknown. It provided a visual confirmation that the Atlantic was bridged not just by convoys, but by people. It reminded London that the war was no longer a British war. It was a world war in which the United States was no longer an arsenal in the distance, but a partner on the ground. The numbers behind the parade revealed the scale of what lay ahead. By the end of 1942, 200,000 American troops were there. By mid-1943, that number would swell to over 500,000. Operation Bolero eventually transported more than 1.5 million American service members to the United Kingdom. They built or expanded more than 100 airfields, laid nearly 800 kilometers of railway track, constructed hospitals with tens of thousands of beds, and erected tent cities. American factories produced nearly 90,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and over 150 aircraft carriers and escort carriers by the end of the war. They churned out 8 million rifles, billions of rounds of ammunition, billions of cans of food. They built Liberty ships at the rate of one every 3 days, launching more than 2,000. They produced enough trucks to form convoys that stretched from Liverpool to London. Britain's own industry still contributed mightily, but it could not match those quantities. The British government had introduced rationing of meat, butter, sugar, eggs, and even clothing. Tea was rationed. Coal was rationed. American rations seemed luxurious by comparison. The Americans' pay, nearly 4 times that of their British counterparts, allowed them to fill pubs and buy gifts for their hosts. The average American soldier made $50 a week. A British private made little more than that a week. Yet as months passed, respect grew. British soldiers saw the Americans practice with their rifles and artillery. They saw their willingness to fight. They saw their discipline in the face of air raids where they would sit in shelters and sing. The parade also signaled logistical alignment. Convoys from New York began to arrive more frequently. Each convoy included dozens of troop ships and cargo vessels escorted by destroyers and corvettes. These ships brought not only men but also trucks, jeeps, ambulances, telephones, radar sets, canned ham, dried eggs, powdered milk, cigarettes, soap and filters. American engineers constructed fuel depots in remote fields, connected by pipelines to supply staging areas. American medical officers set up hospitals that would later treat the wounded from Sicily and Normandy. Quartermasters established depots in the west of England filled with blankets, boots, helmets, tents. The British marveled at the organization. Everything had a label. Everything had a name. American soldiers joked that there was a manual for manual writing. British humorists responded with cartoons of GIs reading field manuals on how to ask for a cup of tea. Behind the humor lay admiration. The Americans seemed to have a system for everything. They did not always follow British protocol, but they got things done. British officers sometimes bristled at the Americans' informality. Salutes given too casually, boots unpolished, slouching in chairs. In time, both sides adjusted. Joint exercises were held on Salisbury Plain. American soldiers learned to fight in hedgerows. British soldiers learned about American weapons. Airmen exchanged tips on bombing. For Churchill, the parade symbolized more than numbers. He had long cherished a special connection between Britain and the United States. His mother had been American. He had spent summers in New York as a child. He had a weakness for American food and American slang. He loved telling stories of his experiences in the United States during the First World War. He believed strongly that the English-speaking peoples were bound by history, language, and law. He had told the British Parliament that the British Empire and Commonwealth and the United States will, for their own security and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace. That day in July confirmed his belief. He saw sons of farmers from Kansas and sons of miners from Yorkshire, now part of a single army of democracy. He saw the blending of accents, uniforms, and traditions. He saw the combination of British resilience and American abundance. He knew that the alliance would not always be smooth. He knew there would be disagreements about strategy, about where to strike first, about the distribution of bombers, about the leadership in the Mediterranean. But he also knew that the foundation had been laid. As he watched the Americans march past the cenotaph, he thought of those lost in the Great War and those who were yet to die in this one. He thought of his friend Franklin Roosevelt, confined to a wheelchair, leading a nation across a continent. He thought of those factory workers in Michigan and California, whose hands would forge the weapons that would liberate Europe. He also thought of the moral effect. Britain had fought alone and had drawn strength from that loneliness. The phrase, "we shall fight on the beaches," had become more than words. It had become a belief. Yet loneliness can be exhausting. The parade told Britons that they were no longer alone. The sound of foreign boots on their streets was the sound of relief. The cheers from the crowds were not just for the Americans. They were for themselves, for surviving long enough to see reinforcements. They were for the free French sailors in their blue uniforms, for the Polish pilots who had defended British skies, for the Canadians who had died at Dieppe. They were for the soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean who had fought in the deserts of Libya. The presence of the United States did not diminish their sacrifices, it completed them. The parade did not erase grief, rationing, or fatigue. It did not end the war, but infused hope. In letters home, American soldiers described the day. A sergeant from Kansas wrote to his mother that London was both beautiful and scarred. He described marching past Trafalgar Square and seeing Nelson's column wrapped in scaffolding. He told her that British people cheered loudly and that he had never felt prouder. Another soldier wrote to his fiancée in Iowa that he saw Winston Churchill in person. He said he could hardly believe that he was marching before the man whose voice he had heard over the radio. A nurse from Georgia wrote to her father about London fog and tea, about how British children lined the parade route. A black soldier from Alabama wrote home about the strange feeling of being welcomed in a foreign land while facing segregation in his own army. He wrote of gratitude for the cheers and of the pain of being required to eat separately from his white comrades. A Puerto Rican soldier wrote in Spanish to his mother that the people of London were warm despite the cold. Their letters were censored, but their feelings came through. They were proud to be part of something larger than themselves. They sensed that history was taking shape around them. They sensed that their actions would matter. The wider consequences of the American buildup in Britain extended beyond morale. The logistics of war changed. The Atlantic became a highway. Convoys of ships crossed regularly. Escorts used sonar and radar. The Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park read U-boat communications. Liberty ships delivered not only supplies for Britain, but also equipment destined for the Soviet Union through the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. American troops trained in Scotland for landings in North Africa. In November 1942, Operation Torch sent American and British troops to Algeria and Morocco. American forces stationed in Britain provided support and were ready to move if Germany invaded Spain. They learned to coordinate with the Royal Navy. They learned to handle British spanners in British terms. They learned to drink tea at 4 in the afternoon and to refer to French fries as chips. In return, Londoners learned to pronounce Missouri properly and discovered peanut butter. In 1943, the Allied leaders met at Casablanca and later at Tehran. They agreed on a strategy of Germany first. They agreed to open a second front in Europe by invading France. Churchill pressed for continued operations in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt insisted on preparing for a cross-channel invasion. The combined chiefs of staff planned Operation Overlord. They needed assembly areas for thousands of troops and vehicles. They needed training grounds for amphibious landings. They needed massive depots of supplies. Britain became the staging ground. The number of Americans grew. By May 1944, more than 1.5 million American troops were in Britain. Tanks and trucks filled hedgerows and fields in the south. Aircraft filled the skies. Paratroopers trained by leaping from towers. Engineers laid duckboards in marshes and built mulberry harbors. Nurses prepared for tens of thousands of wounded. Medics trained to treat bullet wounds and shrapnel. Barrage balloons dotted the skyline once more. The partnership deepened. Friendships grew. Marriages occurred. Thousands of British women married American servicemen. Many of those women later crossed the Atlantic as war brides. Some British towns hosted American Thanksgiving dinners for the first time. American GIs tasted mince pies and Christmas pudding. British children tasted chewing gum and Hershey bars. Together, they endured the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets that fell on London in 1944 and early 1945. American anti-aircraft units fired at those rockets. American engineers repaired runways after strikes. American doctors worked alongside British nurses in underground hospitals. American chaplains preached sermons in British churches. The alliance was no longer an idea, but a daily reality. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, the sight of American troops in London had become common. Yet for those who remembered that first parade in July 1942, the memory remained vivid. They recalled the crisp uniforms, the steady drumbeat, the sense of something greater beginning. They recalled Churchill's whispered words and the look in his eyes. They recalled the feeling that the balance had shifted. The march had been a symbol. Symbols matter in war. They sustain people when news is grim. They provide images to hold on to when loved ones are far away. That parade provided such an image. It was reproduced in newsreels and newspapers. It became part of the collective memory. When London celebrated victory in Europe on May 8, 1945, people again filled the streets. They again saw Churchill on a balcony. This time, the war in Europe was over. American and British flags flew together. The partnership had triumphed. The parade of 1942 had been a prologue to that victory. Years later, Churchill would recall the parade with affection. He wrote in his memoirs that he was deeply moved by the sight of American troops marching through London on their National Day. He acknowledged that their arrival was decisive. He noted that he had felt a huge relief, a gladness that the agony of solitude was over. He admitted that the alliance had friction, but that it achieved results. His words echoed those he had said on the balcony of the Ministry of Health on VE Day. "This is your victory." He meant not only Britain's victory, but the victory of a partnership born of necessity and cemented by mutual respect. Historians would later debate details. How many troops marched, what route they took, whether Churchill's exact words were this or that. Such debates mattered less than the essence. The parade marked a turning point in the war and a turning point in the relationship between Britain and the United States. In retrospect, the significance of that early morning in July lies as much in the emotional realm as in the strategic. War is numbers and plans, guns and fuel, but it is also hearts and feelings. The British heart had been battered but resilient. It had survived Dunkirk, the Blitz, the Battle of the Atlantic. It had endured alone. When those American boots echoed through London, the British heart heard a different sound. It heard the assurance that it would not break. It heard the promise of reinforcement of shared burdens. It heard a message to the world. Democracy would fight as one. The American heart, in turn, felt the weight of history on foreign stone. Young men who had never left their own states looked upon buildings older than their country. They marched through streets where kings and queens had passed. They felt the eyes of a nation upon them. They felt pride, anxiety, curiosity. They sensed that their presence mattered far beyond the parade route. The moment also captured a philosophical truth that Churchill had articulated in speeches long before America entered the war. In June 1940, with France about to surrender, he had addressed the House of Commons. He said that if the British Empire and Commonwealth lasted 1,000 years, men would still say this was their finest hour. In that speech, he reached across the Atlantic. He expressed his belief that if the old world were overwhelmed by tyranny, the new world, with its power and might, would step forth. That phrase had comforted Britons through dark months. When Churchill saw the Americans march, he knew that his faith had been justified. He saw not a parade, but the materialization of a promise. He saw proof that words matter, that appeals to shared values can bear fruit, even if delayed. He saw the confluence of democracy's forces. He saw the harnessing of industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and political will. He saw a lesson for the future. Alliances must be tended, nourished, built on respect, not just convenience. In the years since, generations have returned to photographs of that day. They examine the faces of the soldiers, the style of their helmets, the cut of their jackets. They notice the mixture of seriousness and youth. They sense the weight of expectations. For many Americans, the parade is an early chapter in their nation's rise to global leadership. For many Britons, it is a memory of relief and gratitude. For those who study the war, it is a reminder of the intangible factors that sustain nations. Factories and tanks matter. So do parades, words, and whispers. Words can warn, persuade, inspire. Parades can signal unity and resolve. Whispered remarks between leaders can capture an epic. One such whisper, uttered by an exhausted man watching young soldiers march past bomb-damaged buildings, lives on because it distilled a continent's hope. The war continued for 3 more years. More Americans died on the beaches of Anzio, in the skies over Berlin, on the cliffs of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes. More British sailors died in the Barents Sea and in the Mediterranean. More civilians died in bombings. More sacrifices were required. The road to Berlin was long. The road to Tokyo was longer. Yet from that July morning onward, no one in Britain doubted that the road would be traveled together. When the war ended and the post-war world took shape, the partnership forged between Britain and the United States remained. It faced new challenges: decolonization, the Cold War, economic hardship. It endured because it was built not only on treaties and interests, but also on shared memories. One of those memories is of drums beating, boots pounding, flags waving, and a prime minister murmuring words of faith. The act of marching conveys more than movement. It is a promise in motion. When American soldiers marched through London for the first time in the Second World War, they fulfilled a promise implicit in speeches and laws. They showed that the might of the United States would not remain across an ocean, but would cross it. They embodied the union of 2 democracies with different histories, but a common cause. They lifted the spirits of a war-weary people. They marked the beginning of a cascade of men and material that would flood into Britain and then into Europe. They signaled that the industrial power of America would be harnessed to the strategic and moral struggle of Britain. They made real the words Churchill had spoken in darkness. As the parade ended that day, the American soldiers marched back to their temporary barracks. The crowds dispersed, returning to their daily struggles of queuing for food, tending allotments, sifting through rubble. A young boy clutched a small American flag that a soldier had handed him. An old veteran folded his cap with care. A housewife wiped her eyes and smiled. Churchill returned to his office, lit another cigar, and wrote notes for a cabinet meeting. In the evening, he broadcast a message to the British people. He spoke of friendship, of unity, of perseverance. He reminded listeners that the war was far from over. He urged continued sacrifice. Yet the timbre of his voice carried something new, a steadiness born of companionship. He concluded by thanking the people for their courage and by welcoming the new ally with simple words. There was no bombast, no flourish. Sometimes the most profound statements are the simplest. Sometimes the most powerful gestures are the quietest. That day taught that lesson. War reduces life to essentials: food, fuel, metal, courage. It also magnifies gestures. The sight of soldiers marching can become an emblem of survival. For Londoners in July 1942, the sight of Americans marching was exactly that. It told them that the struggle they had endured would not be in vain. It told them that their patience and fortitude had been rewarded. It told them that the world had heard their pleas. It told them that the words, "We shall fight on," were not shouted into a void. It told them that the new world had indeed come to the rescue of the old, not as conqueror, but as partner. That knowledge sustained them through the blackouts and the buzz bombs, the shortages and the separations. It sustained them until the final victory. When historians recount the Second World War, They often speak of battles, dates, tonnage. Those are important. But sometimes a march can tell as much as an invasion. Sometimes the measured beat of boots on a street can resonate across oceans and decades. On that July day in London, the sound of those boots echoed beyond Westminster. It echoed across the Atlantic and into the pages of history. It echoed through every factory in Detroit and Sheffield, through every wheat field in Iowa and Norfolk, through every home listening to the radio in Harlem and Glasgow. It echoed through the hearts of those who believed in freedom and those who feared tyranny. It still echoes, faintly but persistently. It is a reminder that alliances are lived, not just signed. It is a reminder that promises must be honored, that words must become deeds. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a march can light a path. As dusk fell on that day, Londoners lit few lights. Blackout restrictions remained. The faint glow of lanterns illuminated faces for a moment and then vanished. Somewhere, a piano played a quiet tune. A dog barked. On distant fields, American soldiers lay in their new barracks and wrote letters. One wrote that London's fog seemed to hide ghosts. Another wrote that he had never felt more alive. Somewhere, Churchill sat alone for a moment, cigar smoke curling above his head, and thought about the journey ahead. He knew there would be setbacks, disappointments, tragedies. He knew the road to Berlin and Tokyo would be paved with blood. But he also knew that history had shifted. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had heard it with his ears. He had felt it in his bones. As he later wrote, he felt buoyant and serene. The old world and the new had joined hands. From that moment, a battered island nation no longer stood alone. The American boots on London streets announced not only a parade, but a partnership. They announced not only a celebration, but a commitment. They announced not only a holiday, but a turning point. The echo of those boots became the drumbeat of victory.